At just 12 years old, Tom Jones was staring down a life-changing diagnosis: tuberculosis. Back in those days, TB wasn't just a health scare. It was a threat that could strip away your future. He found himself confined in a crumbling Welsh sanatorium for nearly 2 full years, isolated from everything he knew. The walls were cold. The food stopped tasting like home, and each cough echoed like a reminder that his life could be slipping away. That solitude became the unexpected crucible for his voice. With nothing to do but pass the time, he filled the silence with song. Sometimes he'd hum old hymns from church, but other times he'd bell out everything from folk tunes to the latest American swing. His voice gained power by necessity. Singing was the only thing that reached beyond the tedium of bed rest and sterile halls. One day, a nurse passed him a battered record player and a stack of 78s, big band crooners, even early rock and roll. At first it was a luxury, just another distraction. But soon, he found himself practicing harmonies under his blankets late into the night. He'd mimic the swoon of Sinatra, then let it rip into something deeper and raw. Feverish coughs punctuated each rehearsal, and every inhale was tinted with pain. But by the time he left the sanatorium, his lungs were stronger, his voice richer, and his determination hardened. When Jones finally returned upon typewriter, people said he'd come back like a man reborn. His lungs had cleared, but the lingering whisper of vulnerability shaped his tone. He carried with him a sense of fragility wrapped in a burgeoning confidence, the voice of someone who knew how close to the edge he'd been and how powerful he could be now. That period never left him. Even decades later, when he was packing stadiums, he'd say his time in the sanatorium taught him grit, humility, and a voice that could cut straight to the heart. And listeners felt it. Songs that could have been bland or dated instead carried a haunting ache, an emotional gravity that made even a simple ballad feel like confession. Yet that illness, as brutal as it was, served as the most unlikely catalyst for his career. Without it, he might never have realized the full potential of his instrument. The isolation forged depth and resilience, and fans picking up his first singles might never guess how close he'd come to never singing at all. But that was just the start. The scars of childhood illness weren't just physical. They built an emotional foundation, one he'd lean on as fame descended and his secrets began to compound. And trust me, the story only gets more turbulent from here. While most boys at 16 are chasing first dates or scribbling song lyrics in class, Tom Jones was already lost in something far deeper. Her name was Linda Trenchard, a local girl who'd lived just a few doors down in Pontypridd. She wasn't a fleeting crush. Linda was a constant in his life, the first real anchor he ever had. Even during his time isolated with TB, he'd lie in bed picturing her face, imagining what it would be like to walk with her again, to hear her laugh. It wasn't puppy love. It was obsession masked as devotion. He once admitted that seeing her walk past his window when he was too sick to leave his bed was almost unbearable. She didn't know he was there, watching. That image, her silhouette passing by, free and untouchable, etched itself into his mind. It wasn't just longing. It was the sense that life was happening without him, and Linda was at the center of it. When he finally recovered, Tom didn't waste time. By 17, he and Linda were married, and not just because of passion. She was pregnant. In a time when scandal meant shame and options were limited, marriage was both a solution and a sentence. They wed in a small ceremony, with barely a penny between them. And suddenly, the boy who had nearly died in a hospital bed was now a father and husband working in a glove factory to survive. The romance didn't fade, but the pressure mounted quickly. Tom was a teenager juggling diapers and dead-end jobs while secretly nursing the dream of becoming a singer. Every local gig, every pub performance was a shot at escape, but it came at a cost. Linda stayed home with their son, watching her young husband chase a dream that felt more distant than ever. The tension between ambition and responsibility started pulling them in opposite directions. And yet, there was something hauntingly loyal about their bond. Tom would later admit to countless affairs, hundreds, if the tabloids were even half right, but he never divorced her, never truly let her go. It was as if that early connection, forged through sickness and sacrifice, bound them together in a way that fame couldn't dissolve. Linda, for her part, wasn't silent. She reportedly despised the spotlight and hated the circus that followed Tom everywhere. While he became a sex symbol, she stayed in the shadows, growing increasingly bitter, even reclusive. Friends claimed she smashed his gold records and banned him from speaking about music at home. But even then, she didn't leave. She endured. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was raw, imperfect, and at times quietly tragic. Two kids who were forced to grow up too fast, clinging to love in the middle of chaos. And for Tom, that emotional push-pull, love, regret, guilt, seeped into every song he sang. But marriage wasn't the only weight he carried as his career took off. With fame came temptation, and soon, Tom Jones would find himself caught in a whirlwind of adoration, scandal, and secrets that threatened to tear it all apart. By the time most teenagers are choosing between college or a job, Tom Jones was neck-deep in diapers and double shifts. At just 17, he was already a husband and a father, married to Linda Trenchard, working long hours in a glove factory, and quietly trying to build a music career from scratch. It was a life that moved too fast and offered little room to breathe. But Tom had already survived worse. Tuberculosis had nearly taken him out. What was exhaustion compared to that? Still, the pressure was brutal. Pontyper was a hard town, and the expectations were even harder. A working-class man was supposed to clock in, feed his family, and bury his dreams. But Tom was never wired that way. He didn't just want to sing. He had to. Music was the one part of him that hadn't been crushed by obligation. So after long shift hauling loads and smelling of rubber, he'd head out to smoky pubs and working men's clubs, pouring his soul into gritty renditions of blues standards and American soul. And people noticed. The voice was impossible to ignore. Raw, booming, and drenched in emotion, it cut through bar noise like a knife. Audiences weren't just impressed. They were floored. Local buzz grew fast. But inside, Tom was split in two. Family man by day, dream chaser by night. It wasn't sustainable. At home, Linda wasn't thrilled. She had traded her youth for early motherhood and a marriage that was starting to feel more like a compromise than a partnership. Tom's late nights and rising ambitions created friction. She didn't want to be left behind, and he couldn't afford to stop. That tension became the undercurrent of everything. Every argument, every gig, every tender moment that turned into silence. But in 1964, a break came. Tom, now performing under the name Tom Jones at the suggestion of his manager, Gordon Mills, got a shot at recording a single. That first track didn't make a splash, but Mills was relentless. A year later, It's Not Unusual exploded onto the scene, and overnight, Tom was no longer a struggling singer. He was a star. Fame didn't come slowly. It hit like a hammer. Suddenly, he was booked on Top of the Pops, flying to America, doing Vegas. The man who once punched in at a glove factory was now rubbing shoulders with Elvis and Sinatra. It was everything he'd worked for, and exactly what Linda feared. With success came separation. She stayed in the UK, largely out of the spotlight, while Tom's new world became hotels, entourages, and screaming fans throwing underwear on stage. The life they had built, humble, grounded, real, was replaced by something surreal. And for all the glitz, Tom was haunted by a creeping guilt. He once said that the more famous he got, the more he missed the ordinary life he'd been so desperate to escape. But success wasn't just straining his marriage. It was cracking open a darker part of himself. The attention, the temptation, the constant praise, it fed something. And soon, that hunger would take him places even he couldn't have predicted. Tom Jones didn't just become famous. He became a phenomenon. It's Not Unusual wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural flashpoint. Suddenly, the Welshman with a thunderous voice was everywhere. TV, radio, magazines. He wasn't just singing anymore. He was seducing entire nations. Las Vegas called, and Tom answered. It was glitzy, fast, and dangerous. He stepped into a world dripping with temptation, endless alcohol, seductive crowds, and women who didn't care that he wore a wedding ring. On stage, he was electric. He'd sweat through his shirts, thrust his hips with wild intensity, and belt notes that left audiences gasping. It was animalistic and raw, part rock star, part sex symbol, and the crowd fed off it. Women threw underwear, room keys, and phone numbers. Journalists estimated he was sleeping with up to 250 women a year. When asked, Tom didn't deny it. He laughed. It was the 60s, after all, and he was the poster boy for indulgence. But behind the scenes, things weren't nearly as smooth. Linda, still in the UK, was well aware of the rumors. While he was gracing the covers of magazines, she was raising their son and battling waves of humiliation. She didn't smile for cameras or chase fame. Instead, she retreated, angry, isolated, and disillusioned. Friends said she'd break his records, smash the trophies, curse the phone whenever a female voice was on the line. Tom, for his part, struggled with guilt. He loved Linda in a way that was complicated, rooted in history and shaped by hardship, but he couldn't stop himself. Fame had unlocked a version of him that wasn't content with stability. He craved more applause, more adoration, more chaos. He once described it like being on fire. Each night on stage stoked the flames, and afterward he needed something or someone to keep them burning. As his career soared, so did the whispers. Affairs with other celebrities, backstage tantrums, even brief rifts with his own management. His bond with Elvis Presley, while real, was laced with rivalry. Elvis reportedly admired Tom's raw vocal power, but their relationship was also fueled by mutual envy. Two kings in the same jungle. The duality was stark. The adoring public saw a charming crooner with a golden voice. Behind the curtain was a man running from his past, from his pain, and maybe even from himself. The higher he climbed, the more distant he became from the humble boy who once sang to survive in a sanatorium. Vegas didn't just change his bank account. It rewired his soul. And yet, through it all, his voice never faltered. That pain, that longing, it seeped into every lyric, every performance. You could feel it, even if you didn't know where it came from. But there was more under the surface. Because while the fame and fortune painted one picture, Tom Jones was quietly building a list of enemies, personal regrets, and lifelong tensions that would eventually come back to haunt him. Beneath the stage lights and diamond-studded suits, Tom Jones was waging battles the public never saw. By the late 1960s, he wasn't just a singer. He was a brand, a commodity, and, to some, a threat. And with that level of success came competition, jealousy, and cracks in his carefully curated image. His management team, led by Gordon Mills, the same man who discovered him, had become both a lifeline and a leash. Mills was aggressive, business-minded, and focused on turning Tom into a global icon. But that meant shaping not just his career, but his personality. Jones once admitted he felt like a puppet in those early years, singing what he was told, smiling when cameras rolled, and burying the rougher edges of his identity. The voice belonged to him, but the career, that belonged to someone else. As the money rolled in, so did the disputes, backroom arguments over royalties, pressure to overwork, and creative control began to sour their relationship. Jones, always a proud man, didn't like being told who he was. He wanted more say, more freedom. But in the high-stakes world of international fame, autonomy came at a cost. Quiet, legal wrangling and power plays simmered beneath the surface. It was never open war, but the tension was constant. Then there was a rivalry with Elvis Presley, a strange, complicated bond that teetered between admiration and competition. When the two met in Las Vegas, they clicked immediately. Elvis was intrigued by Tom's explosive stage presence and vocal strength. He reportedly told him, "You've got the best voice in the business." But Elvis, the so-called king, didn't like being overshadowed, and Tom had a way of doing just that. In private, Presley envied Tom's physical health, his booming performances, and the fact that Jones never needed a gimmick, he just sang. Meanwhile, Jones watched as Elvis, caught in his own spiraling world of pills and handlers, became increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. Their friendship faded, replaced by unspoken tension. When Elvis died in 1977, Tom was shaken but not surprised. The cautionary tale had played out in front of him, but rivalries weren't limited to Elvis. Back home in the UK, Tom was criticized for going to Hollywood. Some British critics labeled him a sellout, accusing him of abandoning his roots for the glamour of American fame. Other artists, especially emerging British rock stars, saw him as part of the old guard, safe, sanitized, and overly polished. Behind closed doors, there were whispers that Tom was too commercial, too obsessed with image, and too reliant on sex appeal. Even in his personal circle, there were fractures. Friends from Pontypridd who'd once cheered him on began to fade away, replaced by handlers and publicists. The fame that had elevated him had also isolated him. He was no longer Tom Woodward from Wales. He was Tom Jones, a symbol, an icon, detached from his origins and surrounded by people who wanted something. And yet, through all this, he kept performing, kept pushing, kept surviving. But the pressure had to go somewhere, and eventually it would erupt in a moment that forced him to face the one thing he tried to avoid his entire life: the price of losing control. By the late 1980s, the Tom Jones brand had started to wear thin. The Vegas act, once cutting-edge and explosive, was now seen as kitschy, trapped in a time capsule of flashy suits and hip thrusts. The music industry had moved on. Rock had hardened. Pop had evolved. And while Tom's voice was still a powerhouse, the world wasn't listening the same way. The spotlight that had once been blinding was beginning to dim. Behind the scenes, the cracks in his empire widened. His longtime manager, Gordon Mills, the architect of his rise, died in 1986. The man who had discovered, molded, and in some ways controlled Tom was suddenly gone, and with him went the infrastructure that had kept everything steady. Tom was lost in the silence. He was adrift, unsure how to navigate the industry without the man who'd engineered his every move. Financial trouble followed. Poor investments, outdated contracts, and a rapidly shifting market left him scrambling. Some close to him claimed he was on the verge of being broke. Not in the sense of poverty, but a dramatic fall from multi-millionaire comfort to uncertain footing. And then there was Linda, still his wife, still holding on, but barely. She had long since withdrawn from the public eye, and now she withdrew emotionally. They weren't divorced, but they weren't really together either. Their marriage, held together by loyalty rather than closeness, had become almost symbolic. And then something unexpected happened. Tom's son, Mark, who had spent his childhood watching his father juggle fame and family, stepped in. By the early 1990s, Mark became his manager. But this wasn't about nostalgia. Mark saw something others didn't, a chance for reinvention. He helped Tom shed the glitter and find a new sound, one that leaned into his soulful roots rather than the glammed-up Vegas persona that had become a parody. The result? A career rebirth few could have predicted. In 1999, Tom released the album Reload, a collection of duets with younger artists like the Cardigans, Moose T, and Robbie Williams. It was gritty, modern, and shockingly relevant. The single Sex Bomb became an unlikely anthem for a new generation. Sultry, unapologetic, and distinctly Tom. Suddenly, he wasn't just a legend. He was cool again. The comeback wasn't just about sound. It was about owning his story. Tom stopped trying to be the polished icon of the past and leaned into flawed, fascinating man he really was. He spoke more candidly in interviews, admitted to his faults, acknowledged the mistakes. That rawness, honesty layered over bravado, resonated in a way the old showman act never could. And through it all, his voice never faded. If anything, it aged like whiskey, rougher, deeper, but just as commanding. But success after collapse leaves a mark. And as Tom re-entered the spotlight with new identity, There was one chapter of his life that remained painfully unresolved, a loss that would strip away the fame, the music, and the myth, and reveal the man underneath. For decades, Linda Trencher was a quiet shadow behind Tom Jones's roaring spotlight. Their marriage had never been glamorous or perfect. It was a story of survival, sacrifice, and complicated loyalty. But in 2016, everything changed when Linda passed away quietly, away from the public eye. The news hit Tom hard, revealing a layer of pain that the tabloids never captured. Linda's death wasn't headline-grabbing or scandalous. It was personal and deeply private. After years of separation and everything but name, their connection remained unbroken. Friends say Tom was devastated, describing it as the loss of his first love, his longest-standing anchor in a life defined by chaos and change. Despite rumors and infidelities, Linda was his emotional bedrock, the one who had stood by him through sickness, poverty, and fame. What made their story so poignant was the complexity of their bond. Linda had witnessed Tom's wild rise and tumultuous fall, the parties, the affairs, the adulation, and the controversies. She never sought fame or fortune, choosing instead a life far from the glare of cameras. But her presence was felt, her love, her anger, her pain, all threaded through Tom's music and interviews. If you knew where to listen. Tom never spoke much about Linda in public, but the grief was evident in his rare mentions of her. He once said their marriage was the most important thing in his life, even if it wasn't perfect. And in interviews after her death, he sounded more reflective, more vulnerable, as if the weight of their shared history finally found a voice. Linda's passing reopened old wounds, memories of youth, sacrifice, and the heavy price of fame. It reminded fans that behind the charismatic performer was a man who had endured loss and heartbreak, just like anyone else. The tragedy wasn't just in her death, but in the years they spent apart emotionally, caught in the web of fame, distance, and unspoken regrets. Yet in that loss, Tom found something unexpected: clarity. Without Linda, the myth and the mask fell away even more. He began embracing a quieter life, focusing more on family and the music that carried the echoes of their past. It was a rebirth not marked by flashing cameras, but by honest reflection. The tragedy behind his early fame wasn't just about the wild success or the scandals. It was about the personal sacrifices, the love that endured despite everything and the heavy toll it took. And while Tom Jones remains an icon, his story is a reminder that behind every legend is a deeply human journey, full of loss, resilience, and the search for meaning beyond the spotlight.